Dan Parks, tell me, have you ever been in a situation where in your illustrious 67 test career, you've been pulled off with 20 to go and you've just seen the game slip away before your eyes?
Great opening question, Christy. Obviously you're referring to what happened in the England All Blacks game with Marcus Smith, who was probably having one of the games of his career. In complete control of that game, kicking well. He obviously set up that try with the intercept. Yeah, he was looking really sharp. And unfortunately for him in England, things didn't work out in that last 20 minutes. But I guess that's footy. In regards to myself, it's happened a few times. There was one time in particular we were playing. I was playing for Connacht. We were playing in a game over in Treviso. It was obviously just a club game, it wasn't an international game. But it was one of those moments. We gave up a score, but we were still certainly well and truly in it. It was about 50 minutes in. I got dragged. The crowd were not impressed. I had a good relationship with the Italian and French crowds when I was playing my club footy over in the in UK and Ireland. And mate, I watched from the bench, was not happy, and the game got completely away from us in the end. But I think in that sort of scenario, Marcus Smith, he'll be looking at that. I guess of anything, he's probably the only winner. If you're an Englishman, he's the only winner out of that scenario. Now that's, we can laugh, but that's probably the reality, right? He was absolutely killing it. He was having a great day, and I get a bit annoyed at the moment with all the. Yes, it's a 23-man game, but there's blokes that can easily play 80 minutes. There's no need to substitute everyone that sits on that bench. And and I can tell you now, looking and knowing the type of player Smith is, he doesn't want to be coming off after 60 minutes. He can play 80 minutes.
No, you're totally right. So, of course, what we're referring to at the moment, Marcus Smith, 17 points he had scored. They were up England 22-14 with 20 to go. He gets dragged, and then the All Blacks then go on to score the next 10 points, a converted try and a penalty to Damien McKenzie. The All Blacks with a great escape, George Ford having a frustrating last couple of minutes where he missed a penalty and a field goal from in front. So England lose, but they are the Wallabies' opponent this weekend. The first test here on a Grand Slam tour for the Wallabies, the first since 2016. And if you're wondering why Dan Parks is joining me, we'll find out a little bit more on the other side. So, yes, a very different voice joining me at the moment. Dan Parks, 67 tests for Scotland. He's probably got a story very similar to what is their new Scottish captain, Sione Tuipulotu. And we'll talk a bit more about Scotland's big win over Fiji later on. But no Matt Samoa for the next couple of weeks. He's snowed under with work. So I went through the contact book and I thought, you know what? Who's the person that always gets caught up during an end-of-year spring tour, as we'll call it down in Australia? The Autumn Nation Series is what it's being referred to at large. And that's Dan Parks. Dan, bloody good to see you, mate. And you've been a busy man. You've been a bit of the voice for Shoot Shield coverage over the last year or so, but you're still firmly amongst the rugby scene.
It's good to see you too, Christian. Thanks for the call. Literally 20 minutes ago, mate. Came at the last minute, and I was obviously doing some stuff here in the office at work, but timing allowed, mate. But I'm absolutely delighted to be here. It's good to see you looking fresh-faced as ever. Mate. Still staying involved in the rugby. For those fans out there who are connected with the Shoot Shield, I do a bit of commentary on there. And this year in particular, what a great season it was. That grand final day. Northern Suburbs fans obviously will be absolutely heartbroken, but the Beasties coming good with that 1-point victory, and it was a classic afternoon at Leichhardt Oval. But certainly staying involved in the game, and I love making comments from time to time.
Actually, funnily enough, the last time I saw you was, and I was at that amazing Shoot Shield final. The last time I saw you was in the days leading up to that with the King Catch Pole medal. There was a lot of sledging going on towards and directed at the eastern suburbs, and fair play to them. A great drought breaking, more than half a century drought breaking between drinks there with the title. And I know that you were in good form after a few beers with Darren Coleman, the former Warwick Towers coach. He'll be looking to make a statement. Actually, and the Shoot Shield's been in the headlines, interestingly, late last week. And I know that I'd kind of caught wind of about it a couple of days earlier around, do they separate and break away from the Stan Sports coverage? Do they, because of Shoot Shield is there to make some money and be able to stand up on 2 feet and support the clubs as best as possible as well. So more to play out there, given that they've been bundled together with the Rugby Australia rugby package with Stan over the last few years. So we'll see whether or not they remain with Stan beyond 2026. But good to be talking rugby, with you. And this week, made mention of it off the top, the Wallabies and England. Before we get there, I think it's actually, we've got to almost go back to last weekend, because Australia and Joe Schmidt would have been watching so closely what unfolded with the events of England and New Zealand. Were you surprised by how close it was, or did you always think that it was going to be an epic?
I wouldn't mind coming back on that Shoot Shield comment earlier on. I think at some stage, I reckon, I think just quickly on that, I think we've been pretty blessed, any club rugby fan, to be able to get every single Shoot Shield match live ad friend on demand, been able to watch it live. I think it's a pretty cool thing. That certainly wasn't something, when I was growing up, you were able to do. So I think for the fan out there who wants to watch as much rugby as possible, getting that coverage is pretty much second to none. Obviously, that being able to show it on free-to-air TV would be huge as well. And maybe there's something in the contract going forward we could look at. But, I personally know as a rugby fan, it's great to be able to jump on a Sunday morning and watch the minis or the highlight packages of all the club games. So, but just quickly on that, the England New Zealand game, I'm not gonna say I get really surprised at any sort of games of rugby, to be honest. I think on anyone's given day, it can be extremely competitive, and I think that was just another example of that. And I think New Zealand, it's taken them a bit of time under Razor Robertson. Obviously, there's been a lot of chat about him taking over, and he's clearly got an unbelievable coaching record. And, he had a lot of time at Canterbury to really set himself up there, and he was hugely successful. And I think since he's taken over at New Zealand, a lot of what he's dealing with is trying to find the right combinations. I think, it's so important, especially at an international level. It's hard enough at the grassroots club and then onto state level, but international, you've really got to try and make it happen pretty quickly. And I think, there's certainly, I think some green shoots starting to appear for New Zealand. I think England, it was their first test for quite a while. Again, on paper, a very, very strong team. And again, for 60 minutes, they were looking pretty good. If it wasn't for a few, I guess, you might want to call them probably, I guess, soft tries at international level that England led in.
Oh, they were soft, weren't they?
Yeah,
on out wide, in the middle, there were gaps. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. And I think if you look at it, it was obviously Ellis Genge on both occasions, but he, just one of those circumstances that he found himself on the edge with the Talea first try. Now, even for Talea to do that with 1 metre of room to move, he showed incredible gas. Gets around the big prop, who was, I thought, immense for the time he was on the field. His scrummaging was absolutely brilliant. And he's just a really good, solid player around the park. And then, unfortunately, New Zealand being New Zealand, Bodie Barrett, he worked it out perfectly. And once Jordan gets in the clear, he's bloody hard to stop. And that's what happened.
Well, we'll dig a bit deeper there, because it was a tactical, those couple of moments there, a tactical masterclass. Like, it was brilliant from Mark Talea, who looks like he's regained his form from 2023. It was probably his slowest start to the international season. He lost his spot, but the manipulation of attack there, you saw from the scrum. They go, phase play, and you see Beauden Barrett sweep from one side of the field to the blind side, and then he picks out, and Will Jordan picks out that it's Ellis Genge in front of him. And it's a pretty simple play in the end. They made it look so easy, didn't they? Yeah. But in terms of picking and eyes up rugby and knowing who it is from a one-on-one perspective, it was just first class from Barrett and Jordan.
Well, yeah, again, you mentioned all those names. Bodie Barrett, he's been class for so long now. He's ageless. He's a phenomenal player. And Will Jordan, I think it's 36 tries out of 38 tests.
Yeah.
I think is the number. Like, mate, that's just unbelievable statistics. And, every time he seems to get the ball, he's an incredible danger. So back to the point at the start, I think England, not for those two moments, they could have been in an even more commanding position what they were after the 60. And, poor old George Ford, he gets on, I guess his role in that scenario is to close out the game. And most, he does it most of the time. He's very, very good at it. But for whatever reason on the weekend, New Zealand, again, Talea found himself with a bit of space, bit of beautiful handling down that right edge once again. And unfortunately, he ran over the top of George Ford, which is tough on a smaller bloke. But, to me, you've got to give Talea a lot of credit there. And Mackenzie's kick from the sideline, well, that was pretty epic.
They kicked their goals when they needed to. Like, even Beauden Barrett, we do shine the light on Mackenzie for nudging them ahead 24-22, but it was Barrett in the first half that from the sideline as well. That knocked it over when Talea scored. So a 3-1 win. The one try that England scored was a magnificent intercept from Smith, who gave the board to, I think it was Furbank, who quickly distributed to his winger, who finished brilliantly. And they were up and about. You listen to all those that were up at Twickenham and the renamed Allianz. And it was one of the days where Twickers is going off, apparently. So to be able to come back, and they came back through the scrummaging. Will Stewart goes off the field, Genge goes off, and then they found some ascendancy there, the All Blacks up front at the scrum. So you just wonder, Mike Cron would have been looking at their targeting. They would be very much thinking Taniela Tupou, can he find some ascendancy there from a scrummaging perspective? But before we get there, like, a lot of the criticism is going on the decision to take off, for Steve Borthwick's decision to take off the halves pairing. Ben Spencer was doing a fine job himself, and in addition, Smith, who had scored 17 points, having a day out. But, even Randall coming on is a bit of a zip kind of player, loves to play, loves to take the game on. It's not just the 10 that changes there. The ball wasn't that great. It was above his head. It was probably a bit messy. It was a few phases on. It just wasn't the ideal way of how to set up a field goal. Nonetheless, a bloke of George Ford's ability, who did it throughout the World Cup from 45 metres out, you would have expected him to bang that one over.
Oh, yeah. And I think it's one of those scenarios, like, you look back now in hindsight and you say, well, obviously they would have, England didn't have to make those substitutions. It's only 8 points. It's a test match. You're playing against the All Blacks. You're 9-10, are in complete control of the game. You mentioned two names earlier on. You mentioned Stewart. You mentioned Genge. They are dominant. So even for them, like, yes, I know it's very important. They've got 4 tests. They've got to look after themselves. But, in that position in the game, would they have been better off to keep them on the field? Possibly so on reflection. But I guess when you get back to the George Ford scenario, when you have that opportunity, and to your point, he's kicked those on numerous occasions, sometimes it's just not your day. I think that was the reality. Clearly, it was Marcus Smith's day for 60. And then for that last 20 minutes, it hasn't happened very often. But for George Ford, he hits the goalposts on the long-range attempted penalty. Fortunately for England, New Zealand lose the ball, so they get a scrum pretty much 5 metres out right in front of the sticks. Now, there was opportunities to probably go for that a bit earlier on. They waited. They were almost playing for a penalty, which is what happens a lot in international rugby at the moment. And, yeah, unfortunately for him, it didn't go to plan. But, that can happen. That's rugby. Obviously, it was just it was New Zealand's day. But for a long portion of that game, England were in control. So, they won't look at last week, I don't think, as a real negative on what they're doing. I'd say they'd be very positive and buoyant about what they've done. And I think it's one of those ones. Which way do Australia look at it? Do they look at it as if this is a good thing that they lost, or would they have preferred them to win and then potentially come in a little bit soft? But I still think England, regardless, they're going to be coming in hot against the Wallabies, wanting to really, mark their dominance on where they are as well.
Yeah, it's a good question. And actually, much like the All Blacks with their second half struggles, maybe not necessarily woes, where they barely managed a point throughout the Rugby Championship in that last half an hour, England, similarly against the All Blacks, had only scored 3 points in the final 30 minutes of the 3 tests that they played against the All Blacks this year, which is pretty remarkable. We know that they were so deeply in the contest in the 2 tests down in New Zealand earlier this year, where they just went down by a score in both those matches. So, yeah, really frustrating for them. But I agree, like, there's a lot of positives from an English bowler for England. Just looked like an absolute powerhouse, much like Wasiliev. He looks like one of the real finds of this season. Where do you think, if you're the Wallabies, they're going to be heavy outsiders, and I haven't seen any form of betting odds around what they are, but I imagine that they're probably 12, 14-point outsiders heading to this. They've only won 1 test against England since 2016, and that came in Perth in 2022. I think they're 1 from 12 since that World Cup win in 2015. Like, they go in as serious outsiders. We'll talk about the team in a little bit, but if you're Joe Schmidt, where do you think you can potentially attack Steve Borthwick's side?
You got some great stats there, Christy. I'm impressed, mate. That's quite incredible. All those different stats. I had no idea it was only 1 of 12, to be honest. Well, again, I think, obviously it's like any test. Whenever you play doesn't matter what game of rugby, you've got to match them up front. Doesn't matter who you're playing against. And that's generally how all games go. And in particular, it'll be no different this week. And England, clearly, they'll take a lot of benefit out of last week's game, in particular up front and in the scrum. And I have no doubt those 2 gentlemen, Genge and Stewart, if fit, they'll take their place. So, yeah, I think if Australia could potentially match them up front, like as an Australian rugby fan, I am extremely excited about what I'm seeing in the press, because we're actually getting some press in the country at the moment, which I think has been really, really good. And obviously, I think Joseph Suaalii has got a lot to do with that, which is brilliant. Hence the reason why he was, I think, signed to Australian rugby, was to create a bit of, a bit of publicity, but also for his unbelievable sporting ability. And there's been a little bit of commentary around. It makes a bit of a mockery about picking him. Well, isn't that the whole reason why he was signed to rugby, was to play? Why would you not play him? That's certainly my argument on it. He wants to play. He's ready to play. Everything says he should be playing. So, if I'm an Australian rugby fan, I want to see what some of these backs have got to offer, because by including himself, Samu Karevi potentially being back in the mix, like, we're talking about 2 very, very exciting rugby players. And already with the sprinkling of other talent, I know you're going to mention in a second, but, Kellaway, Wright, Peach potentially. There's so many others. The halves, Jake Gordon, probably Noel Alessio, and Tom Wright, I think, has been probably one of the most exciting talents certainly we've seen, in this Wallabies calendar. So, to me, I reckon that back line and the potential that's in there, we haven't even talked about the forwards, but, Fraser McRae would be close to the World Player of the Year at the moment, I'd say.
Well, it's funny that you mentioned we haven't spoken about the forwards, and you're right to highlight some of the potency that's on offer in that back line. But the back rows, I went to the John Eales medal last week. It's actually been renamed the Rugby Australia Awards, but it centres around the John Eales medal. Rob Valentini back to back, and his the 2 other candidates were Harry Wilson and Fraser McRae. So that points to a back row that is starting to find its feet as a combination, but also the 3 of them being 3 of Australia's best players this year over 9 matches. Generally speaking, they include the end of year test, but because of the end of the World Cup, it then goes for whatever matches before the spring tour. So, yeah, I like the look of that back row. I can't imagine there'll be too many changes in the pack. Maybe Brandon Payeringamosa potentially pushing to start. He's kind of considered as the best scrummaging hooker there, and that's where you've very much got to meet the challenge up front against Jamie George and his English. So, yeah, that'll be fascinating to see. 34-man squad there and a 30-man squad for the Australia 15 fixture, which will be 24 hours earlier against Bristol over at Ashton Gate. And so there's a lot of people there. There's a lot of people for Joe Schmidt to work out who's who in the zoo, but I really don't think there'll be that many changes from the Belletta side. One that there will definitely be is no Hunter Paisami. So he was never going on the first match. They decided he's going to have a baby rather, so he'll stay behind for the first match, perhaps the second before the baby arrives. But as it turns out, he got a calf injury the very last training session before they left. So he was therefore ruled out. So it means that there's an opening at 12, and there's not actually another specialist 12 in the Wallabies squad other than Samu Karevi. So you imagine that he returns, maybe is the only change to that back line. We know that Peach came in for Marika Korobetti, who's not in the squad for that second Bledisloe match. But yeah, I can't see any other changes to the back line. But what do you think of Karevi does, and what does he bring? We know that he didn't have the best World Cup campaign, perhaps a bit underdone after coming back from a couple of injuries, including an ACL 2022, playing for the Australians in the Commonwealth Games. But we didn't see the best of Karevi, but he's still a pretty big figure to be able to bring back into that midfield.
Oh, yeah. Like, I've been a huge fan of his for many, many years. And I think there's a few things, obviously, that he adds, and that's power, size. He's a brute, and he's got great skills. He's got the ability to offload through contact, very, very similar, obviously, to likes of Martin Nonu over the years. But he's a real quality player. And if you go back a couple of years, he was, I would have to say, one of the Wallabies' most consistent performers whenever he was in and around the squad. It was great to see him go back, through the media, seeing him back amongst the group. And, I must say, for myself, obviously a Scottish rugby fan, but also a Wallaby fan, and seeing him back involved, I just feel like there's a real buzz. I really do. I look at it from an outsider. We mentioned Joseph Suaalii coming into the group. And I just reckon they've been building. I've known Joe Schmidt for a long time through my association, through playing club rugby in Ireland firstly, and then obviously at the international level, and knowing him as a man and as a coach. Like he's going to make a proper difference, and you can already see the impact he's having on the group. So the more time he spends with them, the more they're going to be comfortable with him, and he'll get things right. And I reckon this tour is going to be, a really positive one for the Wallabies. And I just think the inclusion of some of those guys that we just have mentioned, it's just going to add so much. That it's all about the camaraderie, and I just get the impression that we're going to see that in the next 3 to 4 games.
I'm not quite sure why Joseph Suaalii is now referring to himself as a Joseph Akusu Suaalii, but that's nonetheless how he's going by. Morgan Tiranui pretty strong over the weekend, thinking that he's going to be part of the 23, potentially start. The talk has been outside centre or the wing to begin with, and I agree with you. Tom Wright's playing well enough, even though Michael Cheika thinks that Suaalii's go eventually is at fullback. You wouldn't be starting him there from the outset. You'd probably be thinking more around that 13 and wing channel. His last match, from my understanding, was back in 4 years ago for the Australian schoolboys in their win against New Zealand schools across the ditch. It was a bit of a drought breaker for them. He hasn't played since. He's been with the Wallabies for a couple of weeks. Historically, Joe Schmidt's spoken about liking to have these players for another week or so before giving him a crack. Do you see someone like Suaalii, so much investment, so much hype, so much... I don't want to say that the Wallabies and Australian rugby rests upon Joseph Suaalii working out, but you wouldn't want him to necessarily go in limpy and struggle, and then Joe Schmidt's left with the decision, do we play him the week after? Like, would you be thinking that he can make a difference from the outset, or would you be giving him a couple of weeks more to learn the plays, the intricacies around the breakdown before putting him in?
Yeah, great questions, and I think there's going to be debates either way. Me personally, I'd put him in. I reckon because he's such a talent, he's an absolutely wonderful athlete. I'd probably say initially you'd put him on the wing. I would have thought that would be the place to start him. I think 13 is a big ask, as we all know as rugby fans. 13 defensively is probably the toughest position to defend from. So I think that would be a big ask. I think it needs a bit of time there to get used to different attacking shapes and so on. But I reckon you could potentially, not saying wing's any easier, but I reckon that's a spot where you could put him. As we know, he's remarkable under a high ball. So in the backfield, and knowing English, they don't mind a box kick, they don't mind a crossfield kick. So there'll be plenty of those type of tactics going on, and I think he would be more than capable of dealing with it. You could bring him off the wing to add impact, add punch into your attack. I just reckon, to me personally, it's a bit of a no-brainer. I reckon he's been paid a hell of a lot of money to bring results and to bring a bit of excitement to the game. And what better way to start against England at Twickenham? Like, you imagine, all the eyeballs watching that. It would be, to me, that's what Australian rugby needs. And I'm sure if he doesn't, then there's a plan around that for Joe Schmidt, because, as I said earlier on, he does have a plan around most things. So, yeah, but that would be my thoughts.
Yeah, it's like, I know that there's a lot of people thinking that, and perhaps Joe Schmidt we'll find out late Thursday night, Friday, the wee hours of the Friday morning when the team is officially released. But I just think when you go back to, say, Israel Folau, when he was introduced, he had a full runway of Super Rugby with the Waratahs. He'd made a trial. His first match, I think, was against the Crusaders in front of about 5,000 people. It's a stark contrast between playing in front of 80,000 in your first match in 4 years to playing in front of 5,000 in a trial game of Super Rugby. Even Marika Korobetti, when he came in, he was taken as a development player. He hadn't played rugby, which is different to Swaling, but he was taken on a development player, played the full season with the Rebels, didn't play the July test. Then he gets eased in against Argentina, I think down in Canberra, where his first match was. Like, I don't have an issue with, I know that everyone's talking about the British and Irish Lions is only 4 or 5 tests away. Like, should we be thinking, get him in now so he can learn positions? But I just don't. There's a bit of me that goes, let's just hold him back, because we don't want this. We don't want confidence to be dented. He's a confident guy, but if I think about the perfect way to introduce someone, I think more around the Folau and the Korobetti than throwing him in from the outset and going, mate, you've got all the talent in the world, now show it.
Yeah, and I think to that point, I think I'm just coming at it from a rugby fan's perspective, that everyone is so excited by the fact that he's arrived. He wants to play. Let's get him in there. But, knowing, again, Joe Schmidt, he's a very shrewd man. He won't be doing anything rash. If it is around the development process and getting him in amongst the group, getting them to understand, it might be a fact that, he plays him late in the tour. I think the last couple of games are against Scotland and Ireland. He might see an opportunity there. But as I said, as a rugby fan, I think we all want to see him as early as we possibly can.
Does the rugby fan, though, lose hope? Do they start, bringing their pitchforks to Rugby Australia and demanding Phil Waugh resign if Suwali doesn't work from the outset? Like, if he struggles? Because then everyone will immediately go, well, hang on, why are we paying $1.6 million or thereabouts for a guy that isn't the saviour of the Wallabies or isn't what he was necessarily made out to be?
Well, I hope not. I hope that's not the case. As I said to you, all my indications from what I'm seeing, I've followed rugby for a long time now, and I think we all recognise at times it feels like rugby in this country has been a bit down the doldrums. No one really watching it. No one's really talking about it. To me, recently I was at the Sydney Test. It was close to a capacity. I think that was the biggest. Was it 80,000 or something?
It was an absolute picture there on an afternoon against the All Blacks, and I think it was actually just a nudge under 70,000, but it looks like more.
But I know it was the biggest crowd that certainly Australian rugby has seen for a hell of a long time. So I think if you're looking at it from that perspective, that's an extremely positive, a positive step. And I think, as I said earlier on, I just feel that the inclusion of some of these guys in this squad. I just think, me personally, I think it's boding very well for the Wallabies. It's going to be, obviously, I think it's going to be very exciting, autumn series, they're calling it. But even more so in the build-up to next year, we've obviously got the Super Rugby, and then we're going to go into that Lions series, which is going to be absolutely huge. And I think that's where the real test will be. Joe Schmidt will have been in the role for quite a while now, and he would have had at least 12 or 13 odd tests under his belt. So we'll get a clear indication of where the Wallabies are at then. But for me personally, I reckon they're going to be in a pretty pretty good spot. And I think with the calibre of players that, I reckon we'll give the Lions a good run for their money.
Yeah. Well, look, that's a mouth-watering prospect, and it's not far away now as when we're at the start of November. I think the last big selection call this week, anyway, is what to do about Will Skelton. I can't imagine he's going to be rushed in. He played for La Rochelle on the weekend. If you haven't seen it, an awesome footage of him scoring, standing out in the wing, which he wouldn't find himself there very often, and somehow gets to the try line. But given that he would have only had 2 full sessions, a Tuesday hit out, a bit of a Monday one, and a bit of a Thursday one. I just can't see him being thrown in, even off the bench at this late stage. I reckon you'll more likely see him against Wales. Whether or not he starts, we'll see. We'll find out. It might be determined by what happens this weekend. But, yeah, Suwali and probably Jorgensen up for I dare say they're playing for the one position, and that might be the 23 jersey. But either way, a couple of handy prospects, and I think you could be closer to the money. I reckon there's a stronger than even chance that Suwali features. What do you think is I'll ask you for a bit of a tip around what you think the scoreline might be, but what do you think a good result for the Wallabies are on these 4 matches? Is 2 wins, like that statistically it's a pass if you get 2 wins, but realistically, I think anyone, if they manage 2 wins, I think it'd be a better than a pass result. But if they only get the 1, you might be thinking, right, okay, that's what they got in 2014. They managed to play in the World Cup final a year later. But you probably want to see more than 1. Will it happen this weekend?
Well, I think just to that point there, if you're looking at the game, so we've got, we've got England first up, then Wales, then Scotland and Ireland. We'll talk about Scotland in a second, but, England, for me, that's a 50-50 toss of the coin. Obviously, England were very unlucky last week to go down, but I still think that possibly the Wallabies might need this game. It's been a while since they've played together, so they might need this game.
6 weeks.
I think they'll beat Wales. I think that they'll do well there. You mentioned Will Skelton already. Like, to have a bloke of his calibre coming into the group, and I reckon, if we could push him in to this game and potentially rest against Wales, if that was at all possible, I'd be probably looking to do that. But I certainly see that as being the likely scenario. Real tough against England. Should beat Wales. Scotland, if you look at, if anyone's seen their footage against Fiji, they were extremely impressive. They scored some absolutely wonderful tries. I thought defensively they were very, very sound throughout the whole game. Don't get me wrong, Fiji were down to 14 men for 60 minutes of the game, where they had 2 yellows back to back, and obviously that helped Scotland in the first half. But Scotland were playing without some of their big guns, Finn Russell in particular. Mind you, Adam Hastings was probably one of the players of the match. But yeah, that'll be another toss of the coin. And if you go to Ireland, Ireland are notorious for being extremely good in the autumn series, and I don't see it being any different this year. So to your point, it could possibly just be the 1 win, but on the other hand, they could potentially snare 3 if things go their way as well. So don't discount that. But I don't necessarily think if it's only 1 win, it's considered a disappointing tour, because, again, I think there'll be plenty of learnings out of it. One in particular will be around experience of the likes of Suwali and obviously Karevi coming back in. So, but yeah, there's no game of international rugby that's an easy game or that's a guaranteed win. We know that is the case, and these 4 games in particular, they're all going to be very, very testing games.
What do you make of the 10 battle? Because I think it'll be Noah Lolesio that starts this week. It'd be a massive call if he wasn't to play, having started in, I think, 7 of the 9 tests to date. Ben Donaldson started against Argentina once and against Georgia in Sydney as well. Can you see, how do you think his progression is going from 2022 when he last played up in the Northern Hemisphere? And would you like to see Tane Edmond given an opportunity at some point in time? Do you think he and Ben can challenge, or will, or should challenge Lolesio?
Yeah, I think there's no doubt that there'll be certainly a lot of competition between those 3. I think what I do like, as a former 10 is, and as any player, rugby player, you just want to be in the side and you want to know that your coach is behind you. And I think certainly Joe Schmidt has shown that he is behind Lalesio. And it's the same with Jake Gordon. It's pretty clear at the moment that he looks at Gordon as his number 1-9. He's played in all the big games. And I think Lalesio is certainly in that category. Donaldson, I think whenever he's played for Australia, he hasn't let them down. He's been a very solid performer, and I don't see any reason why he wouldn't be. The interesting one, as you said before, was around Taine, because, Taine probably left to go overseas and play over in New Zealand in the NPC. And I don't know if too many people expected him to do what he did. He was, I think, to be honest, he was just quite phenomenal in what he did and what he achieved over there. And I think he's going to come back with a tremendous amount of confidence. There's no question about that. From the whispers I've heard around camp and while he was actually in the NPC, is that Schmidt was a big fan of his. And a lot of people would have seen him as an absolute bolter. No one would have expected. But I think the reality is, if you were part of the circles and you knew a bit of what was going on, was that Taine Edmed was going to be a threat and potential opportunity to play some time for the Wallabies. I have no doubt he's going to play time on the tour, potentially even, maybe next week against Wales. But I would say this week they'll probably look at certainly a Noah to start and possibly a Benny Donaldson to bench. But don't be surprised if those other two guys get a lot more game time as the tournament rolls on, or as the 4 games roll on.
Is there a bit of Taine's game? Like, you would have seen him a bit in Shoot Shield as well. Like, he's not played a huge amount this season, but is there something about Taine's game that you like or you think can stand up to international rugby? It's obviously very different to the NPC, which is loose as anything, but you're still going to be able to take your opportunities and show your skill set.
Yeah, and I think at Shoot Shield level, he's proven over many years that he's capable of doing all things at any given time. He can kick his goals. He can find space in the backfield and kicking. He's got a tremendous running game. He's got a nice short passing game. So he's got all the attributes. His issue has always been being able to combine them together. And I think that's potentially where, and I'm sure the Australian selectors are looking at it, he's gone over to New Zealand. To your point, extremely loose. In that loose environment, he was quite remarkable. Like, he thrived in that environment. So let's just hope when he plays at this next level, it doesn't get any higher than playing international rugby, and it's a tough place to set that marker. But I'm pretty confident he's got all the attributes, and particularly if you've got a coach that's right behind you. You don't ever underestimate how much a coach getting behind you and really being in your corner, how much that means to players and how much it can really inspire them. So don't be surprised if Taine takes his game to the next level. But I'd have to say, you mentioned those three players there, like, we're not in bad hands. I think ultimately we, as a nation, you'd like to know who your number 1 is, because I think that's so important to know who your main guy is. And I think if you look at it right now, Joe is certainly leaning towards Noah as his guy. But who's to say, as I said, at the end of this tour, we might be talking about someone else as that number 1 guy.
Well, you need to find out a bit more from Noah. Like, at some point in time, you want to see him just stand up and dominate a game a bit more, or at least command the side a bit more. He does that for the Brumbies really well. I don't think we've seen that yet for the Wallabies, and that's probably when you're thinking around the Wallabies' progression this year. You've seen some big steps forward by a number of players. Valentini's kicked on, Mick Wright's kicked on, Jeremy Williams has stood up and really shown that he belongs in this kind of international environment, whether or not it's a 6 perhaps one day. Tom Wright's taken a step forward. So you want to see Noah, who made his debut in 2020 now, start to be able to step up. Like, you've mentioned Joe Schmidt in your relationship a couple of times. So when did you first meet him, and talk us about your relationship and what you know about him?
So, when I say relationship, it would have been the late 2000s, 9, that sort of time, 2010. He was coaching at Leinster. At the time I was playing at Glasgow, had a stint in Cardiff as well before I moved on to Connacht. But certainly in those earlier years when I was at Glasgow and Cardiff, he was coaching at Leinster. And then from there, he took over and obviously back then, very similar to how they are now, but they pretty much won everything. They were winning Heineken Cups. They were winning, the local, what they called back then, it was called the Magners League, which was Scotland, Ireland and Wales competition. So he was always a winner. He'd come from New Zealand, from NPC Rugby. He moved over to France where he was coaching there, had success at Clermont, and then obviously he moved into Ireland. So he'd always been successful wherever he'd been. And then he took over the Ireland job. And I just remember at different times when I was playing in Connacht, the way it would work is, my understanding was the national coaches in Joe Schmidt at the time, he would go to each province one day a week. And obviously at Connacht, I think he used to come to us on a Tuesday. So there was the 4 provinces, obviously being Ulster, Connacht, Munster and Leinster, and he'd share the load around. He'd go to each of those provinces once a week. But what it did was it would show that Ireland Rugby were following and tracking all their players. And I was just fascinating to listen and to see how he would interact, in particular with the Irish eligible players. But there was also interactions he would have with me around my game and just offering little bits and pieces and, getting me to look at different clips in games. And his brain, I found quite incredible that he would remember so many different things from games. And, hey, Parksy, keep an eye on minute 16:36. Just watch it. It's a 5-second clip. And, you'd go back and you'd be like, how? Like, I'm one bloke in that squad of whatever it was, 35 odd blokes. And I'm sure he was doing to most of the guys there. And that always sat with me. I always found him to be a really respectful man. He was always very, very friendly, pre-game and then after game as well, regardless of the result. And I just knew that, if Australian rugby was ever lucky enough to have him on board, then he would make a big impact. And I've already seen that impact. I've been to a few lunches before the Wallabies had any tests, and you could just see, he's going to be well liked, and he's got a real desire to win, and that's what he is. He's a winner.
10 Parks at a lunch, you wouldn't dream about it. Just before we kick on a little bit about Fiji and Scotland and even Ireland, New Zealand, touch on that. What's your best memory of playing up north? This time of year, everyone's licking their lips. Six Nations, obviously, is probably the biggest tournament outside of a World Cup. But have you got a Twickenham memory to serve up?
Got a Twickenham memory, but it's not a very positive one for Scotland rugby. No, I was lucky enough to play in, I guess you'd call it Johnny Wilkinson's comeback match, which was in 2007. I think he'd been hadn't played too much rugby for a couple of years. We went there, as the Scots always did when I was playing, full of hope and optimism. First game of the Six Nations. And, I think Johnny had a 25-point haul or something like that on the day. There's a clear image of him. His foot has to be a metre out, and the touch judge didn't see it as he puts a ball out over the try line. There's just all those type of things. It was quite an incredible day. Obviously, it was. I'm not going to say it was great to be there, but it was one of those moments that you were happy to be there because of what a spectacle it was. And I guess what it showed for me was how important he was for England rugby and everything that he obviously went on to achieve. 4 years previous, he'd won the World Cup with England, which was obviously massive for the country. And, as I said, he had a bit of a hiatus from playing international rugby, but I remember that game in particular at Twickenham. But, had many fond memories of all the great stadiums over in Europe. And I guess for us, we played against, it was 2010, and we played against New Zealand in the first game of the autumn series, and we went in there again. The media were like, Scotland have got a real chance of upsetting New Zealand here. And anyway, the game started, and I think we got held up in the first couple of minutes, and we're like, oh my God, we've got a real chance here. Chris Patterson kicks us a penalty goal. We're up 3-0 early in the game. It's like, we're on here. And that was, I think, 8 minutes in. I think after the 23rd minute, we were down 35-3. So it sort of put everything into context of where we were at, and I guess the level, we're sort of behind. New Zealand were just absolutely hot. We got I think it ended up 49-3. We were certainly licking our wounds afterwards. But we came out the next week in true underdog style, which is what Scotland were very famous for once upon a time. And I think England had gone down to South Africa the week before convincingly. South Africa had a dominant win. They come up to Murrayfield, had a few too many games of golf during the week, I think. And we managed to beat them up at Murrayfield 21-17 in what was one of Scotland's greatest ever wins, I think. And that was pretty memorable. That was 2010. So, But yeah, they were some fond memories from back in the day. Certainly around the autumn series.
Just on Johnny Sexton, I was listening to the BBC Rugby Union Weekly podcast just the other day, and Johnny Wilkinson, 36 field goals in his illustrious international career. So I'm sure that they would have loved to have had one of those on the weekend.
Too true.
Just hearing you talk about the massive number that the All Blacks managed to rack up in quick succession, it kind of reminded me just then of Scotland against Fiji on the weekend. They came out with a real wet sail and managed to put a few tries. Darcy Graham with 4. We don't necessarily need to go and analyse this in great depth and detail, but the fact of the matter is Hastings put in a great show. And when you don't have Finn Russell there, that's telling you a little bit about Scottish rugby, and they're managing to pluck players from all around the world at the moment to ensure that they're an international threat. So Gregor Townsend will be happy. David Newsapora is up there now, who spent how long, who knows, but he was here with Rugby Australia as a consultant for a hot second. He's now up there for a couple of years. So Nasi, if you're listening, I'm sure he'll do wonders for Scottish rugby, but they're going well, aren't they?
No, they are. And I think in more recent times, Scotland have done well against teams they're expected to be. And I think that's the reality. I think they play well against those teams. Like Fiji would have gone in there for their first game of the tour, a bit underdone. They had 2 yellow cards in the opening 25 minutes. Coach Mick Byrne, I'm sure, would have been extremely frustrated at the yellow cards. And Scotland just took advantage. They really did. They played some wonderful attacking rugby. And you mentioned earlier on Darcy Graham. Excuse me. Darcy Graham scored 4 tries. Now, one of them was a bit of a classic, a bit of luck as well. But, he's been out of the international scene for quite a while. And for him to come back, score 4 tries was brilliant. Hugh Jones looking very dangerous in the centres. Duan van der Merwe always looks dangerous on the wing. And, and Sione Tuipulotu, he had first game as captain in Europe with Scotland. And, he had a relatively quiet game for the level of player he is. So tremendous signs. Scotland were very good up front as well, dominant line out. And again, if you get a chance to see some of the highlights of that game, there's a classic try that Adam Hastings did a flick pass out the back for. It was one of the most dirtiest things you've ever seen, straight into the arms of Hugh Jones. Hugh Jones then put Duan in for his only try of the game. But yeah, they were they're looking. I think they're looking very, very good. They've got South Africa this week. I guess the advantage of that is South Africa haven't had a hit out. It'll be their first game of the tour. So it's always probably a good time to get them. We know what South Africa will bring. They'll bring a lot of physicality. And Scotland are getting better in that department. But as we all know, the firepower South Africa have is quite extreme. So they're going to have to be on their best to potentially get that result. But yeah, I'd say as a nation, I think Greg would be very, very happy. They got some they've got some quality players. Finn Russell comes back in. Everyone knows what his capabilities are. You've seen the impact he's had on Bath. Bath very unlucky to go down in that premiership final last year, and he seems to get better with age. He's such a quality player, and we all love watching him because he just plays so carefree. But I think anyone that's close to him knows that he's not carefree. He cares a lot about what he does. He just has that persona, and whatever he has, it works because he's quality.
Yeah, you're not wrong. So that game in the early hours of Monday morning, Australian Eastern Daylight Time, and it all kicks off really the international banquet of rugby this weekend in the early hours of Saturday morning, probably prime time from a Sydney perspective anyway, 7:10, Ireland against New Zealand at the Aviva, the rematch of the 2023 quarterfinal, World Cup quarterfinal, which of course New Zealand prevailed, an absolute epic, and have fond memories being at the Stade de France, watching that one on. So awesome to look forward to. A little bit of other news. It looks like the New Zealand Sevens former assistant, one of a a third-generation All Black in Liam Barry is going to be taking over the Aussie Sevens head coaching job, replacing John Manenti. He kicked off his career, actually, coaching career, working alongside Joe Schmidt there with the Blues as an assistant. So I think that news will come about in the coming days. Wrote about that on the roar.com.au today, but lots to look forward to this weekend. Thanks for your time, Parks. You might almost have to try to rope you in doing this as a regular thing. You can talk underwater, but awesome to have you on board, mate, and on the Roar Rugby Pod today.
No, it's been a pleasure, Christy. And as I said, mate, next time, if you can, just give me a bit more notice and I'll make sure I've got a few more notes ready.
All right. Until next time, you've listened to the Roar Rugby Podcast.